Welcome to the SImple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. I'm your host, Shannon Ables, and whether you're listening on your commute, exercising, working in the garden, or sitting down with a hot cup of tea or a café au lait, thank you for tuning in. Let's get started. Welcome to the 44th episode of the SImple Sophisticate. I want to thank you for your patience, as last week there wasn't an episode of the SImple Sophisticate due to my travels. I had an amazing experience in a book signing event in New Canaan, Connecticut, and I wrote all about it last week and my trip to New York City and all the life lessons I learned last Monday. So if you would like to go look at that to see what I was up to while I was in hiatus on the podcast, you're welcome to go look at that. I will have links to those posts on today's show notes, but I want to thank you for your patience, and I am so excited to be back, as today's topic is something I have been learning about, discovering, diving into, and feeling enlightened by for quite some time now. And I hope to bring a lifting of that burden to you too, if you didn't know about the topic we're talking about, or a deeper understanding of the topic. So what is the topic, you may be wondering? Well, today's episode is all about being a highly sensitive person. Today I'll be sharing what the characteristics are of being a highly sensitive person, but also what a highly sensitive person, or HSP as I'm going to be referring to it throughout the episode, needs to thrive. And once we figure out those tools, it's amazing how we can reach our full potential quicker, more easily, and without unnecessary burden or strife. But before I dive into today's episode, I want to give you a quick teaser as to what today's Petit Plaisir is. I have been doing a lot of traveling these past 2 weeks, and one of my favorite things to do, whether I'm on the plane or in the car, is to listen to podcasts. And many readers ask me, well, you're a podcaster, but what podcasts do you enjoy listening to? It's a great question. I tend to go towards food. I love food and news and politics. One of my favorite podcasts is something I'm going to share with you at the end of today's episode, so be sure to stay tuned. But now, let's dive into today's topic, the highly sensitive person, how to embrace the gift you've been given. Abraham Lincoln, Jane Goodall, Princess Diana, Katharine Hepburn, Martin Luther King Jr., Albert Einstein, Glenn Close, Steve Martin, Eleanor Roosevelt, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Robert Frost, Emily Dickinson. As you might have guessed, based on today's episode's topic, being a highly sensitive person, all of the people I've just mentioned exude traits of the highly sensitive person. Here are a few more. Frank Lloyd Wright, Ansel Adams, Barbra Streisand, Mozart, Neil Young, Alanis Morissette, Elton John, Mother Teresa. In her best-selling book, The Highly Sensitive Person, How to Thrive When the World Overwhelms You, Dr. Elaine Aron, who is a research psychologist, university professor, psychotherapist, and a self-described highly sensitive person herself, states that traditionally poets, writers, teachers, doctors, healers, lawyers, scientists, philosophers, and theologians tend to be seen to have the traits of a highly sensitive person. But notice that the people we're talking about are people that have embraced the strengths that are defined as being highly sensitive. Now, what do we mean by highly sensitive? Let's get to that definition. Highly sensitive persons have an increased sensitivity to stimulation and are more aware of subtleties and process information in a deeper, more reflective way. More importantly, it's important to know if you can self-identify with the traits that we're going to talk about today, you were born with this sensitive nervous system. It is innate. And if you tap into your full potential, you'll be astounded by the gifts you can bring to the world. Quickly, a brief aside about the book by Dr. Elaine Aron. The majority of what I'm going to share with you today is directly from her book, which was published in 1996, but is still selling very strongly, as it was recommended to me by a handful of readers who thought I would enjoy it and be able to find much of myself in there, and I indeed did. So I highly recommend, if this episode speaks to you in any way and you want to learn more, as I'm just going to touch on the surface of it, pick up this book. It's paperback. It was published, as I said, in 1996, but it's still in print, and you can get it, as I'll have a link on today's show notes, www.thesimplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast44. Be sure to highlight it, mark it up, annotate it, and keep it as a resource, because it's very refreshing and validating, as you'll recognize that so much of what many people may have labeled as something must be wrong with you, or why are you so sensitive, is really something that was unique to this trait of being highly sensitive. And once we recognize it, we can turn it into a powerful gift. Another resource I want to recommend as you are listening to a podcast is another podcast that you may enjoy. It's called the Highly Sensitive Person Podcast, aptly named, and it's hosted by Kelly O'Loughlin. She posts about once a week, and she just started this past year, 2014, and I listen to this one regularly. This is not my Petit Plaisir, by the way. This is just a resource from today's episode that I think you'll enjoy. You can go to her website at highlysensitiveperson.net and look at all of the different podcasts, but you can simply subscribe as well in iTunes. I thoroughly enjoy them. They're about 7 to 10 minutes long. They're very short and sweet, but she gives fantastic tips for all different tendencies, because I'm going to go through all 26 characteristics, and I know I'll miss a few, but she will focus on one sensitivity and really talk and tackle how to get used to having it and to make the most of it. And I really think you'll enjoy her approach. It's an easy listening. And again, the Highly Sensitive Person Podcast by Kelly O'Loughlin. I highly recommend it. She also has a book out if you're more interested in books. She just published it in April. It's called A Highly Sensitive Person's Life: Stories and Advice for Those Who Experience the World Intensely. I have not picked that one up yet, but it is on my wish list. But if it's anything like her podcast, I think it'll be a resource to pair alongside Dr. Elaine Aron's. Okay, enough with the resources. Let's get started. I'm going to share a few facts with you really briefly about being highly sensitive. Number one, this is not a typical female or male tendency. This has nothing to do with sex. There are just as many male children born with HSP as there are female. In fact, a study was revealed that was shared in the book on a study of fraternal twins. One twin was indeed highly sensitive, the other was not. So your siblings may not be highly sensitive, and your parents or one of your parents may not be highly sensitive either. It really just depends. I think because of many cultures' stereotypical expectations of men versus women, that it may feel or seem that there are more women that are highly sensitive because they are more encouraged or allowed to express certain sensitivities, even though those sensitivities are actually labeled as inferior in certain cultures. There are just as many men who have HSP, and they've just not been encouraged to exhibit those traits. The second fact I want to share with you is that the study that is used in Elaine Aron's book is that 15 to 20% of the population exhibits highly sensitive traits. And even more so, 22% of people have moderate sensitivity. So while it's still a minority of people having this trait, there are many people that have it. And just to be aware that it does fall in a continuum. So some of the characteristics I talk about today, you may not identify, but maybe majority of them you do. In fact, Elaine Aron has a test, a self-test that you can take to kind of see if indeed how many of these traits you have. And that's in the first chapter of her book. The third fact is that most introverts are highly sensitive people, but there are a few extroverts that are highly sensitive. So we cannot assume that simply because you're highly sensitive, you're also an introvert. That's not true. Now, if you've read the book from 2011 by Susan Cain, Quiet, about the idea of what an introvert is and what they can offer our world and our society, you may remember that she referred often to Dr. Elaine Aron's book. I, a few years ago, wrote about what being an introvert is and the gifts that you're given by being an introvert, and I will share a link to that on today's show notes. And the fourth fact I want to share is that non-HSP people, because that's the majority of people in our world, are not inferior. We're not saying that simply because they don't have this high sensitivity that they're not special or they don't have a gift. It's just that it is different and they experience the world differently. As we may know, and there's a study I'm going to show with you later in the episode, many cultures, the United States and Canada included, praise the non-HSP persona. They don't understand the HSP. Now, Japan, on the other hand, actually values highly these HSP traits. So it really depends on your culture. But if you live in a culture that makes you feel that you are not enough, that your traits are not valued, then it's going to be a tougher road, a tougher struggle. And so we're going to talk about that today, as does Dr. Elaine Aron in her book. So now that we have some of the facts shared as to what an HSP is, who has or could be an HSP person, let's move forward into the characteristics. Now, really quickly, before I do that, maybe you're listening to this podcast, this episode, and you're saying, hey, I know I'm definitely not an HSP. But this is hopefully an episode that if you have someone in your life that you recognize to have these traits, this is a great way to try to understand them a little bit more. If you're in a relationship with someone who has more of these tendencies, it's a great way to strengthen your relationship. And if you're in a career that would make it helpful to you to understand how to deal with people who may have different tendencies, many of which fall into HSP, this may be an episode to listen to. Otherwise, if you are an HSP, you're going to find, I think, great validation. And I, again, highly recommend picking up Elaine Aron's book, as it was something I wish I would have found a heck of a lot sooner, but I'm just thankful that I eventually did. So let's get started. There are 26 characteristics I want to share with you that most HSPs will be able to relate to. And then I will share 19 needs that need to be tended to if an HSP wants to thrive in whichever life they have chosen for themselves. So let's get started. Number 1, the first characteristic is that an HSP is very conscientious. They have a keen awareness of subtle details, and this cultivates then an intuition that is highly accurate. Now, because they are very conscientious and very much aware of those subtle differences and subtle things that happen in behavior and physical movement and moods, they are also people that seek to be perfectionists and also people pleasers. Now, these two things can be detrimental. As we know, being a perfectionist is not a good decision. Instead, we should seek excellence. And being a people pleaser often leaves us forgetting about our own needs. So we need to find a balance. But part of the reason HSPs seek these paths is because they are so highly conscientious. And that is an amazing trait, an absolutely applaudable trait, but we'll just be aware of finding the balance. Now, I'm going to refer later in today's episode about our intuition, having this highly in-tuned intuition. It will come in later, but that is going to be an extraordinary gift that you can use to improve your world. Number 2 is that we define fun, and I'm using air quotes there, differently. For example, an HSP might prefer social outings such as adult education courses or art classes, lectures, symphonies, opera, spiritual retreats, book readings, religious meetings, rather than, say, for example, happy hours at a bar, overcrowded gyms, large cocktail parties. In other words, HSPs prefer more intimate, purpose-driven affairs. Number 3, tend to be sensitive to subtle things in the air, lights, or fabrics. In other words, hay fever, pollens, scents, odors, itchy, scratchy fabrics. Number 4, they tend to be good at tasks that involve observing minor differences. I always, for whatever reason, think of Hercule Poirot, Agatha Christie's sleuth from Belgium, and how they're able to these detectives notice distinct differences that are so subtle and minute to maybe you or I if we did not have that sensitivity. But there are obviously many more careers as well. As a teacher, this is a great ability to have to discern students' moods, their behaviors, the differences from one day to the next, and knowing who can work well and best together. There's so many benefits as a teacher when it comes to being able to observe these subtle differences. Number 5, they tend to be able to focus and concentrate deeply. Now, ideally, this would be without distraction, so without others in the room, but they can do this as well with people around them as well. They're more able to do that. They are more comfortable with their mind. They are more able to recognize how to master their mind and quiet it and focus. That's number 5. Number 6 is that they tend to have an active imagination. They are able to see beyond what is literally in front of them. They can think outside the box, see outside the box. Think of Steve Jobs, for example, and putting all sorts of things together that many people maybe would not have thought of at that time yet. That is a tendency of a highly sensitive person. Number 7, they prefer conversations of substance, philosophy, feelings, and struggle, and dislike idle, pointless chit-chat. Number 8, due to society supposing they are flawed, many have a battered self-confidence and low self-esteem. Now, this isn't the case for every HSP. It truly depends on their upbringing, their childhood, the environment in which they grew up, and where they now exist as adults, and whether or not the society welcomes the traits that they exhibit. Let me just share with you a study that I alluded to earlier in the episode. It involved case studies at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, and the Shanghai Teachers University in China. It compared 480 school children in Shanghai to 296 in Canada to see what traits made children most popular. In China, shy and sensitive children were among those most chosen by others to be friends or playmates. In Canada, shy and sensitive children were among the least chosen. Now, this was a small sampling, but it's something to keep in mind. If your self-esteem is lower than you think it should be, or your self-confidence, reframe. And Elaine Aron talks about this in the book, about the reframing of our experiences as a child. And then we can shift that and turn it into a lesson, a benefit as we move forward. So number 8 is we may be, based on our cultural preferences, more prone to have a low self-confidence or self-esteem. Number 9, many HSPs find their dream job or find their vocation that is something that is focused or deals with finding meaning for our lives. It could be being a blogger. It could be being a teacher. It could be a philosopher, as we saw there in the list at the beginning of the episode. There's so many jobs and vocations out there that it's about exploring, discovery, curiosity, and that is definitely a domain for an HSP. Number 10, you're able to process material at a deeper level. Number 11, you may find that most HSPs are morning people. Now, there are obviously exceptions, but these are people that wake up and they know they have things they want to get done. Their brains are really active and they have all sorts of productivity that they want to get done, and they have this real sense of time and urgency. Number 12, they enjoy time at home to decompress. We're going to talk later in my second list about what an HSP needs to thrive, but there's this idea of containers, either tangible or intangible containers in which we find a sanctuary, which we find ourselves feeling safe. And that is why most HSPs, if their home is a safe place, they like to go home and decompress after each day, or someplace where they feel safe and just really process the day's events. Number 13, over-arousal may lead to not participating in activities with others that you might have enjoyed in other circumstances. And because of this, you may have heard your friends or the people that you were going to enjoy the event with saying, you're missing out, or you may have worries or regrets that you really are missing out. And these feelings of guilt or regrets really are misplaced, because you can go experience that event later or a different time. It may not be when you're able to tomorrow, but eventually in the future you could. But because you're so overwhelmed with emotion and stimuli, you wouldn't have enjoyed it the way you could have had you been able to and took that time to decompress. So don't beat yourself up if you generally find yourself over-aroused and need to step away and not able to go with the crowd, even though it may be something you generally want to do. Listen to yourself. That's where that getting to know yourself comes in and is so vitally important. Number 14, you may have heard common phrases such as, what is the matter with you? Or stop being so sensitive. Number 15, you self-reflect more regularly. You may journal. You may enjoy sitting quietly with your thoughts. Many people may say, you overanalyze things too much. But the key with this idea of overanalyzing is that so long as you don't take it down a destructive path, it can actually be an asset, a benefit, a strength that you have and can use to your benefit. So number 15, they self-reflect more regularly. Number 16, HSPs become aroused more intensely by new and prolonged stimulation. And because of this, and we'll talk about this again in the second list, it is vitally important that you create and establish clear boundaries, are able to establish balance in your life, and are aware again of when and where you become over-aroused and can identify that and find ways to step back and gain your equilibrium again. Number 17 is that an HSP's greatest social fulfillment tends to come from close relationships, and this is also where HSPs tend to shine. HSPs can be quite skilled in close personal relationships, but they also can put up a wall if they've been hurt in the past. Number 18. Due to low self-esteem, they may fall in love with someone very much their inferior. I want to share with you a study that Elaine Aron shares in her book about college students and falling in love. Research finds that 1/3 of college students fall in love during their first year away from home. Dr. Elaine Aron links this to this idea that this tendency to persist in a close relationship out of sheer fear of being alone, over-aroused by all this new stimuli that college offers, and are faced with new and frightening situations. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Definitely something to keep in mind. And so therefore, if you do have a child, or if you are a student who's going into college or to a new college, be aware that latching onto someone, while it may seem like the safe way to go through it all, may not be the best thing to do. And instead to get to know yourself and understand how to balance this overstimulation. Number 19 is that HSPs tend to not share openly with just anyone. People may misunderstand this and label the HSP person as aloof or arrogant or cold, when in reality, you really just don't want to play politics. A suggestion here, because this is the workplace and you do need to maintain healthy relationships and communication, is to have those conversations with those key and trustworthy colleagues in one-on-one conversations. Let them get to know you that way. And also create a clear line of communication with your administrators, your superiors, your boss, whoever is above you. And again, this may be in a more one-on-one environment rather than discussing things in a big meeting with all of the employees. So number 19 is that you tend not to share openly and would rather just share with those few people, those crucial people that you feel you can trust. One thing that many HSPs like to do as far as communication is they're more comfortable with sending letters or emailing or simply communicating with that one person at work that they trust that's actually an extrovert, and that will keep them informed of what's going on in the networking that's going on in that business or that work environment. So something to keep in mind, you do obviously need to learn to communicate and stay involved, but you don't have to do it in a way that overstimulates you or makes you extremely uncomfortable, but you may have to stretch yourself a little bit, and those are a few ideas. Number 20, group brainstorming and team projects are not as productive as you feel stifled and limited, which leads us to number 21, HSPs tend to excel at being self-employed as you can control your hours, your stimulation, the kinds of people you deal with. And unlike many first-time entrepreneurs, Elaine Aron points out that HSPs will tend to probably be more conscientious about research and planning before any risks are taken. However, she also points out, be aware that HSPs may worry excessively and unnecessarily, and that you also may be more inclined to work unthinkable hours as your creative mind is full of ideas and doesn't want to rest. So just keep that balance, keep yourself in check. Number 22 is that due to your high intuition, you can perceive trends in markets and needs and potential before others do. Woohoo! Yay! Number 23, you find tranquility in nature, especially around or in water. Number 24, you are observant and therefore are very successful in understanding and building relationships of trust with children and animals. Number 25, you are more sensitive to pain, and it could be simply getting shots, or it could be anything in between, bruising, responses to pricks and cuts, those kind of sensitivities, it does come into play here. And last but not least, number 26. We're ending on a good note here. HSPs tend to have an artistic side that you enjoy expressing. That wraps up the 26 characteristics of an HSP as derived from Dr. Elaine Aron's book, The Highly Sensitive Person. It's a lot of information. So I'm going to give us a 1-minute intermission to kind of decompress, to debrief on our own minds. And then I'm going to come back and talk about the 19 things that we need to thrive. I'll see you on the other side. Welcome back. We are talking highly sensitive persons, and if you're still with me, you want to know how to thrive, and I'm going to show you how. Again, all this information can be found that we're talking about today on the show notes at thesimplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast 44. I'll have the links and the book that I keep referring to, Dr. Elaine Aron. Links to her book on those show notes. But let's get right in. I have 19 things that an HSP needs to thrive. And the first one, and the most important one, I believe, and that's why I did put it here, is number 1, balance. This whole discussion today is this idea of becoming over-aroused and really keeping in check those low stimuli situations and high stimuli situations. And for the HSP, we get stimulated more quickly, more intensely. And we have to be able to recognize that within ourselves. So when it comes to arousal, getting to know ourselves is crucial. Know and be able to recognize when you are over aroused and stimulated, and then be able to be strong enough within yourself because you've set boundaries to gracefully or tactfully step away, or being able to say no when you know you will become over aroused, and communicating with those people that you are intimately involved with. So number 1 is balance. Number 2, and I briefly mentioned it just a second ago, boundaries. Boundaries need to be set, whether it's at work, whether it's with ourselves, whether it's with our loved ones. These are going to be a fluid thing. They will change and grow depending on the variety of scenarios, but respect yourself enough, and you deserve this. You are worth it to set boundaries. Number 3, you need plenty of downtime. You are probably an introvert. Not all HSPs are introverts, but most of us are. And we become depleted when we put ourselves out there and are constantly being stimulated and are around a lot of other energy. And we need that downtime to recharge. Whereas an extrovert recharges by being in those stimulating experiences. We need the opposite. We need quiet. We need less people, less stimuli so that we can recharge. So number 3 is you need plenty of downtime. And on those same lines, number 4, you need daily alone time. And I did say daily. Elaine Aron says daily. This is maybe that 30 minutes or that hour at the end of the day. Maybe you're that morning person and you need that hour alone to really prep for your day in quiet, reading your paper, sipping your tea, being alone with your thoughts. This could come not just necessarily sitting down, but it could be on a walk. It could be on your drive home. It could be in a handful of different ways, but you do need that every day. And that's again where we set those boundaries. That's where that comes in as well. So number 4 is daily alone time. Number 5 is rest. Rest is vital. We all obviously need sleep, but because we are so sensitive, sleep can sometimes be hard to come by, a restful sleep. So First thing is to make sure that you have evening rituals that really set your mind into that mood of, okay, I'm going to bed, I'm going to sleep, and make sure your sleeping environment is calm, quiet, and tranquil, and really invites sleep and doesn't interrupt your sleep. Another thing that Elaine Aron suggests is if you become tired, give in to that. Take that nap, even if it's at 10 o'clock in the morning. Actually, over this past weekend, right before I taped this episode, as I mentioned earlier, I've been traveling a lot. And granted, I only went over 3 hours of 3 different time zones, but I'm exhausted. And I got up early and did my workout and did some, reading of the newspapers, had my breakfast, and I was exhausted. And I was starting to work on this podcast and I was about ready to fall asleep. So I took a nap, and it ended up being a 2-hour nap, and I feel so much better, but I don't usually need a 2-hour nap, but evidently my body was telling me I did, and so I took it. So listen to your body and respect that, and I think you'll be amazed at how more energized and refreshed you feel. Number 6 is clear communication, especially when it comes to your close and personal relationships, making sure that you understand what this whole HSP thing is and communicating that in a way that's clear to your partner as to what you need. And that's what we're talking about right here, all those needs, and helping them to understand that you need some time alone, that it's not an affront. It's nothing to do with your relationship. It has to do with you being at your best and having a clear communication there. At work as well, and whomever you're working with in any kind of context. So number 6, clear communication. Number 7 is relationships that strike the balance of giving to others and giving to yourself is crucial. Now, there may be an assumption out there, and Elaine Aron points this out, that 2 HSPs in a relationship is the best thing. And we can't necessarily jump to that conclusion. And so then someone may say, well, then maybe you need a yin and a yang, but that may not be the best solution either. It really depends on the people, and it depends on where you fall in the continuum. But she does point this out, and I want to read this quote to you. It's on page 151 if you have the book. She says, "It is my impression that in general, whenever 2 people in a relationship have similar personalities, their understanding of each other is strong, and their conflicts are minimal. That can be boring, but it can also create a safe, quiet harbor from which you each can journey, either out into the world or inwardly. Returning to each other, you can share the excitement vicariously of each other's experiences." End quote. And I think that's just something to keep in mind as you journey out there and start making relationships with people, whether it be friendships or romantic relationships, is something to keep in mind. And number 8, you need time to step away from ordinary thinking. In other words, prayer, meditation. Because our brains, our minds are so busy and creative and imaginative, we need to be conscious about giving them a rest. There are a variety of ways to do this, but anything that really allows you to focus on what you're doing and not be in your head on a regular basis, that's definitely something to try to incorporate into your life. Number 9 is spend time in nature, whether you're taking a walk in it, maybe simply observing it. Maybe it's where you live, fortunately, and you have a yard and you get to be out in, the landscaping, digging in the dirt. Whatever it is, spend time in nature. Number 10, find and enjoy water. Earlier in today's episode, I mentioned that water is a very powerful, positively powerful entity in an HSP's life. So whether it's the rain, spending time around lakes or the ocean or rivers, or simply drinking water, having that relationship, having that time with nature, and it really comes back to number 9, spending time with nature, is actually quite powerful for HSPs. Number 11 is cultivate intense relationships where your emotional sensitivity can run free outside of work. Because if you're depending upon your relationships at work to be your life source for your social, it may backfire in certain situations. So just be careful about that intensity that you bring to work. Maybe keep those relationships professional until you truly can trust that these are people that you can let your guard down with. Number 12, HSPs have a strong need for independence and are afraid of being trapped. And part of this is that HSPs can really conceive of all possibilities. They're able to think down the road, and that also makes them perpetual worriers. So just be aware that having your own independence can be very healthy for HSPs. And it doesn't have to be a physical independence necessarily. It could be financial, or it could just be that you have very healthy relationships that are not codependent and you are able to thrive on your own and then come together. Number 13, you need timeouts from heated or emotional interactions. Often HSPs feel over-aroused or feel trapped, and therefore it's important that you respect yourself enough, have boundaries to step away. You're not ending a conversation and make sure that that conversation is had as well. You're simply postponing it for maybe 15 minutes, maybe an hour, but whatever it is, make sure you come back to it when you're calm and you're not as over-aroused. Number 14, you need to take care of your body, take walks, and that sometimes helps get yourself out of your own head. Number 15, this one's huge, I think. Oftentimes as HSPs, because we like time alone and because we know we need it, we are told that being alone means that we're lonely and it's sad. But this is the thing, you need it, we need it, I need it. It's time that we embrace it. So accept this so-called labeled loneliness, because it goes with what Elaine Aron calls your giftedness. Embrace that terminology if that's what people want to keep throwing around, and see it as a benefit for you to be at your best. Number 16, I mentioned earlier about this whole idea of containers. Intangible containers are vital for an HSP. And now what I mean by intangible containers are you are able to find peace and tranquility within yourself. You're not depending upon outside or tangible things such as a home or a person. Now, those are good. We're going to talk about those in a second, but these intangibles could be something like your faith, your creative thinking, your spiritual exercise, things that are more in your control because they will always be with you wherever you are. Now, tangible ones are great and needed, especially when we're children and growing up and finding our way. And they're good to have as adults as well. It's not like you're ever going to wean yourself off of some of these, but just be aware that they are some aspects that you don't have control over. So like your home, a car, an office, a neighborhood, certain clothing perhaps, a particular hilltop or forest or lake, places, even your library or your church or your yoga studio maybe. But these are places that you go to and you feel safe, secure. You can recharge. You don't feel you'll ever be under attack. And I think for me especially, here's an example. I don't mind travel. I don't mind going and moving to new places. But my one key must have is I must have a place to call home that feels safe. And so when I was going out in Bend and trying to find a place to rent, I needed a place because I'm not buying necessarily right now. I needed a place that I knew I could feel safe in no matter what, because so many other things were going to be new in my life. And I knew as long as I had a secure sanctuary, a home that felt like it was mine and I could be myself in, I'd be fine. And same with my traveling experiences. I always try to find very nice hotels or apartments because I know there's so much new stimuli out there. But so long as I know I can come home to a place that I can be recharged in and feel safe in, I'll be fine. And maybe that's the same thing with you. But those are just some ideas, those examples of intangible and tangible containers. Now, number 17 is that even though we may not want to, we need to experience new things. And in doing so, we need to do this often because it's safe to stay in our houses and not do that. We will eventually realize that the majority of the time, we're going to do just fine. And that is what's going to build our self-esteem and thus our self-confidence as well. So the huge underlying need here is we need to build our self-confidence. We need to build our self-esteem. And the only way to do that in a general statement is to explore and learn what we can do, what we truly are capable of, because we're capable of so much more than we realize. Do it gradually, do it in bits, bring those safe people with you, but make sure that you don't eliminate trying new things entirely. Number 18, simple is best when it comes to HSPs. Why? Because the more stuff, the more ways of doing things, the busier our schedules, the more overstimulated we become. And often a lot of what we're chasing down and a lot of the stuff we have in our house we don't use, we don't need. So simplicity really is the best friend of an HSP. And last but not least, this is more of a collective need, what all HSPs need. We need more HSPs to be present in public roles in our society. If we can remember back to that study I talked about with regards to Canada and China, if our culture doesn't see HSPs and how they work and how they can benefit to society, if they don't see HSPs in those pivotal public roles, it's going to be harder to understand and realize the benefits and strengths they can bring to society. But the more HSPs we have in those public roles, the easier it will be for every one of us now and in the future to embrace being HSP. There's a story that is shared in the Highly Sensitive Person book that I want to share today, and it is, the Romans had a great general named Cincinnatus. The legend is that he had wanted to live quietly on his farm, but was persuaded twice to return to public life to save his people from military disasters. Just as Susan Cain points out in her book, Quiet, we need introverts in our society in pivotal roles. We need extroverts too. We need HSPs in our society in pivotal public roles, just as we need non-HSPs. To have one entirely and not the other is to do a disservice to all of the talent that is lying out in our world untapped. So something to think about. Be brave. Embrace your gifts, because that's really what this is, a gift. And maybe in doing so, you'll inspire others. At the heart of living a simply luxurious life is getting to know yourself. And if along your journey of self-discovery, you realize you are an HSP, it will hopefully be a moment of aha. Perhaps a burden or a weight is lifted from your shoulders, as it was mine. Being an HSP, while not rare, is something most people do not have the fortune to embody. So as you move forward, embracing all of your amazing strengths and learning how to handle weaker tendencies, know that you have something amazing to offer the world. Now you must get about the business of reveling in your full potential. I hope you've enjoyed today's topic. It's been something I've been wanting to share for quite some time. For all the show notes and links that I mentioned throughout the episode, go to thesimplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast44. And remember, the Highly Sensitive Person podcast by Kelly O'Loughlin and Elaine Aron's book, The Highly Sensitive Person. I will have links to all of those on today's show notes. Now, to today's Petit Plaisir, where I'll share one of my favorite podcasts to listen to when I'm decompressing at the end of the day or on my travels when I'm trying to calm down. I'll see you in just a moment. All right, to talk about one of my favorite podcasts is to talk about my love of food. I am always looking for ideas on how and what to cook. Now, I don't always have time to do that, but I'm always looking for creative and unique ways to get in the kitchen, as I find working in the kitchen very therapeutic and a way of really getting away from my thoughts for the moment, as we mentioned earlier in today's episode. So without further ado, the Splendid Table with host Len Rosetta Casper is one of my favorite podcasts to listen to, relax to, and learn from. Recently, as I was driving home from Seattle, I had a 4-hour drive and I downloaded 5 or 6 of her episodes, and it really helped the time to pass. I got lost in her discussions with chefs, with food writers, with actors and celebrities. She had David Sedaris on there from a rebroadcast from last year, and I just learned so much. One of my favorite sections is when she has listeners call in with questions about anything you can imagine in the kitchen, and she is a wealth of information. At the top of her head, what she can come up with is absolutely impressive. Just to give you some background, she wrote a book called The Splendid Table that was published in 1994, and it was one of the first books to win both the James Beard Cookbook of the Year Award as well as the Julia Child Cookbook of the Year Award. And it was Sally Swift, a producer at the time in radio and a foodie, who thought that Lynn could turn her book, her talent, her expertise as she was a cooking teacher and instructor into something more. Since the mid to late 90s, she has had the Splendid Table radio program or podcast that is now syndicated around the nation. It usually airs once a week, depending on your NPR programming, but you can easily jump right on iTunes and subscribe to her podcast. It is a treat, approximately an hour long. You will learn a lot, and her website is full of all the recipes she talks about, plus many more. And if you are a Francophile fan of Julia Child, as I am, there are episodes of Julia Child, who appeared on the show many times. She was a fan of the Splendid Table, and I think when you tune in, you'll find out why. I do hope you enjoy it. I know I do. Links and episodes that were mentioned in this week's Petit Plaisir can be found on today's show notes, thesimplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast44. I hope you've enjoyed this week's Petit Plaisir, where each Monday, at the end of each episode, I share books, ideas, recipes, anything that I think can make the everyday all the more luxurious. Thank you for tuning in to the SImple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. For more ideas and inspiration throughout the week, stop by the blog, thesimplyluxuriouslife.com, or pick up the book, Choosing the Simply Luxurious Life, A Modern Woman's Guide. Until next Monday, I'm your host, Shannon Ables. Bonjour!